One of the largest challenges this generation and the next will face is extreme climate change that is currently happening all over the world. The modern industrialized world created a situation in which excess greenhouse gases were dispelled into the environment for decades without any regulation. In fact, it was not until the Air Pollution Control Act of 1955 that the United States recognized the consequences of industrial emissions. However, it was not until the Clean Air Act, passed by President Nixon in 1970, that the government set environmental standards and regulations for industry, supervised by the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency. Today we face increasing global temperatures, rising sea levels, and the most extreme weather in recorded history. However, many politicians in the United States continue to deny that climate change is real, and continue to oppose legislation to regulate carbon emissions and regulate industry, as many claim that it would devastate the economy. It only fuels the fire, however, that between October 2014 and November 2015, NASA released data that revealed that the Antarctic ice sheet is actually expanding, covering more of the Southern Ocean since NASA began monitoring Arctic ice. Florida Senator and previous presidential candidate Marco Rubio actively opposes environmental legislation, including President Obama's recent legislation to regulate power plant emissions. This is as sea levels around the Miami area have increased by 3.7 inches since 1996, and nuisance flooding is becoming commonplace for South Floridians. This brings me to my knowledge question. To what extent can two contrasting points come to a single conclusion? In this presentation, the areas of knowledge that will be used are natural sciences and ethics, and the ways of knowing of emotion and reason. First, we need to define some of these terms. Emotion is an instinctive feeling that is differentiated from reasoning or knowledge. Reason is the logical thought process used to come to a conclusion. In this presentation, climate change will refer to human actions that have had environmental impacts, such as increased carbon emissions. For my first example, I will use the passing of the Clean Air Act into law in 1970. Today in Congress, representatives are divided on the subject of climate change, with the Republicans traditionally opposing the science and Democrats pushing for more environmental regulations. Today there are more than 170 Republicans in the House that deny climate change. However, this was not always the case. In 1970, there was overwhelming bipartisan support for the Clean Air Act, with not a single nay vote cast. And 4 years later, Republicans were pushing for more regulation by prohibiting industrial pollution in national parks. These politicians pushed aside their concerns for economic policy and the ramifications that this law could have on the economy for the greater good of the environment. In this case, representatives who had opposed climate change came to the conclusion that industrial pollution had to be regulated and worked with Democrats across the aisle to get the law passed. A counterpoint to this example is that in the 112th Congress, Republicans were the most outspoken against climate change than ever before, refusing to provide bipartisan support for environmental policy and siding with the oil and gas industries, voting to weaken environmental policy in order to save these industries possibly billions of dollars. Even Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, a supporter of the Clean Air Act in 1970, actively opposes the current Clean Power Plan as he claims it will have severe economic consequences. Another example is SeaWorld ceasing to breed orca whales in captivity. Public outcry to stop their captivity and to release the whales into the ocean began to gain ground after the CNN documentary Blackfish was released in July 2013. This documentary revealed the horrors that these whales face in captivity, with their extremely small swimming areas and tight quarters with other whales from different pods, which often create tension. Many whales were injured by other whales overnight, and even during live shows at SeaWorld, in which the bloody truth came to light and showed thousands of visitors just how aggravated these whales were. Just a few weeks ago, SeaWorld announced that it would stop breeding orcas effective immediately and phase out their live shows by 2019. This was after their whales, one specifically referred to as Tilikum, killed 3 people, including Kelty Byrne in 1991, Daniel Dukes in 1999, and Don Branchaw in 2010. The strong emotion of the general public to stop the breeding and the shows forced SeaWorld to consider the situation, in which reason was used to come to the conclusion to stop breeding and stop the live shows. However, the whales will not be released into the wild as they were born in captivity, and the use of ocean pens would expose the whales to deadly pathogens and pollution, as demonstrated by the whale who portrayed Free Willy, who died after being put into an ocean pen. A further example is that from The Office. In one episode, the Dunder Mifflin Scranton branch had a surplus in the budget that would have to be spent by the end of the workday, or that amount would be taken out of the budget for the next year. Pam and other co-workers lobbied Michael Scott to buy the whole office new chairs with the surplus, while Jim and Oscar vouched for a new copier. It was only after Michael was told by corporate that he would get 50% of the surplus in a bonus if it was not spent, and went on to describe how much he could buy at Burlington Coat Factory with the almost $700 bonus. The office came to a single conclusion that office chairs would benefit everyone, and that they thought the bonus should be spent on that rather than nothing at all, or rather the bonus in Michael's paycheck. Both parties were passionate about which items they wanted bought, but came to the single conclusion that something was better than nothing. The characters used reason to come to the conclusion that all would benefit from the office chairs instead of the select few that only use the copier. Another real-life situation is the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union in World War II. Tensions were already high before the height of the war, as Joseph Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in August of 1939, vowing not to invade each other for the next 10 years or to support another power that would invade either two, and to deal with differences through negotiation or arbitration. And in addition, in September of 1939, the Soviet Union began their occupation of eastern Poland, in which President Roosevelt condemned the nation, saying that the Soviet Union was, quote, a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. However, the president did say that the United States saw Nazi Germany as the main threat in the world and would align with the Soviets if necessary to defeat Hitler. Further, Roosevelt prevented measures in the House to exclude the Soviet Union from Lend-Lease aid, and when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Soviets, the United States, and Great Britain entered an alliance to defeat Nazi Germany. These nations used reason to set aside their differences and logically come to the conclusion that each alone could not defeat the Nazis, and that they would have to collaborate in order to achieve this common goal. Moreover, my personal involvement in this knowledge issue comes from my experience with the beach. I love to sit down, read a great book while overlooking the ocean, and just listen to the crash of the waves and chirps of the seagulls. This may not be an experience that we will have in the future, and many coastal towns could be underwater within the next 100 years. So I find it disturbing that politicians in Washington and around the world cannot come to a single conclusion about how to deal with man-made climate change when almost everyone in the world is affected. In the case of my first real-life situation, it seems unethical to place emotion and personal beliefs of one politician or individual above the well-beings of millions of people affected by climate change. Understanding that politicians are supposed to be representing the views of their constituents, and that there may be bias due to their district's political views, what gives them the authority, however, to dictate the fate of future unborn generations? Using reason, these politicians should have the ability to work together, regardless of their political views, to come to a single bipartisan agreement about how to deal with carbon emissions and environmental policy. Now to answer the knowledge question. To what extent can two contrasting points come to a single conclusion? The answer, to a large extent. As demonstrated earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union, two nations with possibly the greatest modern rivalry, came to the single conclusion that Nazi Germany had to be defeated. These two countries came together against great odds to overcome a common enemy. And today, the majority of U.S. House members come together and agree upon issues involving immigration, national security, and gay rights. A counterpoint to this knowledge question is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has now been raging for almost 70 years, with little cooperation between the two nations through many failed efforts at ceasefires. This demonstrates that while negotiation and agreement between two groups may be difficult for some, reason allows people to think logically and to collaborate with each other in order to come to a single conclusion that is inclusive to all those involved.